snow didn't fall so much as it wandered, lost and slow, like it too had nowhere to be, but here. This flat, frozen square of dirt and smoke where the town of Dead Mare held its winter auction. She stood on the crate like something forgotten, chin lifted not out of pride but necessity, because if she looked down, the shame might break her spine. Her dress was the same threadbare blue her mother once hemmed with careful hands, now faded and stiff from the cold. Her fingers, raw and red, clutched the sleeves. No gloves, no coat, just skin and fear. Lot 12, called the man with the ledger, his voice a dry crack of tobacco and wind. Able-bodied settler girl. No husband. No prospects. Take her off our hands. Somebody chuckled. Somebody else spat. Her uncle, Thomas Gale, leaned on a post with whiskey breath fogging in the air. She eats too much anyhow, he muttered. Better she work for someone who can afford her keep. She didn't cry. That had dried up weeks ago, sometime after he sold her mother's wedding ring and slapped her for asking about it. Since then, she'd lived mostly in corners and shadows, scouring pans, swallowing silence, and learning what it meant to disappear in plain sight. Now she stood visible and alone. A wiry man with missing teeth shouted, $3 and a hat. Laughter. $5, and she cleans my place till spring. $6, and I take her now. Heat pressed behind her eyes, but she held her breath and ground it down. Not one of them spoke like she was a person, just a shape that moved, something to fill a gap in chores or a gap in bed. The crowd shifted when a horse's steps broke the mockery. A man on a painted bay rode slow through the slush, his dark braid touching the line of his shoulder, his coat thick with fur and silence. He wore no badge, no weapon that showed, but his eyes silenced the crowd more than any sheriff's threat. They were old eyes, not in years, but in knowledge, eyes that had watched too many things die. He dismounted with calm precision and looked not at the girl, but at the crate beneath her feet, as if it were the source of all cruelty. Don't know if Injuns can bid, someone whispered. Better end the rest of you, a woman snapped, but her voice was buried by the wind. The girl's uncle pushed forward. She's mine. You got money, Redskin. The man said nothing. He walked to the edge of the crate and dropped a small leather pouch at the auctioneer's feet. Then he turned back to his horse and whistled. From the trees, 2 mustangs emerged, sleek, strong, and rope-gentle. Their breath puffed like ghosts. He looped their reins together, led them forward, and laid them calmly beside the bag. No words, just horses and silence. Hell, muttered the toothless man. That's near $30 worth. The auctioneer crouched, opened the pouch, eyes wide at what clinked inside. He glanced at the horses, then at the girl, then at the Apache warrior. Deal, he said quickly. Done and done. The girl flinched as her uncle shoved her down from the crate. She stumbled, caught herself, but the impact drove a splinter through her heel. Still, she did not cry out. She merely looked up at the stranger, who now, what? Owned her? He did not reach for her. He did not smile. He simply nodded once and turned to leave. Go on, the auctioneer grunted. Follow your new friend. She hesitated, and then she walked, because there was nothing else to do. She followed him through the quiet crowd, past eyes that either burned or looked away. Mrs. Mercy Crowley turned her lace-gloved hand in the air like she might wave, but it fell limp with judgment. I knew her mother, she whispered to no one in particular. God rest her soul. The girl was always odd. As they reached the edge of a square, the deputy stepped from the shadows of the saloon porch. Whitlow his name was. Long coat, no hat, and a face carved from stone and smoke. He didn't speak, just touched the brim of a ghost hat and let them pass. Beyond the town, the snow deepened, fresh and cold. Her boots leaked. Every step sent chill up her spine. She didn't know if he would kill her or save her. She didn't know if those horses were a gift or a cage. All she knew was that he walked ahead without a backward glance, and she followed because the town behind her had already decided what she was worth. They walked until the lights disappeared and the trees thickened. The only sound was wind in branches and the soft crunch of hooves. Then he stopped. They were in a clearing quiet and wide, where someone had once camped. Ash pits and stacked logs remained under a dusting of snow. He tied the horses, crouched by a dry stump, and began striking flint into kindling. Within moments, a fire breathed orange against the dark. She stood frozen. He didn't motion for her to sit. He just built warmth like it was a fact of life, not a kindness. Then, without looking at her, he pulled off his heavy outer coat and laid it over the log across from him. Still silent, still patient. Her hands shook as she reached for it. Saturday wrapped herself in its weight. It smelled of pine and wind and wood smoke, nothing like sweat or men or fear. She watched him through the flames. "You gonna tell me your name?" she asked, voice rough from disuse. He looked up, slowly. "Cochise." Just that. Not even an echo. She nodded, though the name folded strange on her tongue. I don't got one anymore," she murmured. "They took it when they sold me." Cochise didn't argue, didn't pity, just turned back to the fire, as if that truth needed no correcting. The stars came out, prickled sharp through tree branches. Owls stirred. A distant coyote called and was answered. She leaned closer to the flame and let the warmth seep into the places that had gone numb. It was strange how nothing had happened, and yet everything had changed. She was no longer in a town that saw her as something to bid on. She was here, in woods, beside a man who traded horses for silence. A man who didn't touch her, didn't shame her, didn't ask anything of her at all. And though fear still hovered like smoke on her skin, it did not choke her. She looked at him, then really looked. He was not what the stories made of Apache men. He was lean, yes, and scarred, with eyes that held histories no child should know. But his stillness was not danger. It was something older, something carved from grief and carved again from grace. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, lowered her gaze to the fire. When she finally slept, it was the first time in weeks she didn't dream of running. And somewhere beyond the trees, the snow began again, soft this time, like it had found the place it was meant to fall. By morning, the world had disappeared beneath a white hush. Snow thickened overnight like a secret sealed in wool. The fire was down to its bones, and the girl stirred beneath Cochise's heavy coat, still cocooned on the log. Her breath fogged the air in faint, steady pulses. He was already standing when she opened her eyes, tying bundles, checking the horses. No greeting, no command. Just motion, clean and certain, like a stream cutting through cold stone. When he noticed her awake, he nodded toward a chunk of dried meat on the rock near the fire pit. She took it with careful fingers, as if it might vanish. They did not speak. Not out of awkwardness, but out of shared instinct. Words cost energy, and in the wild, silence meant survival. She followed him as he moved through the trees, his footsteps soundless on snow. He didn't wait for her, but he didn't outpace her either. When she lagged, winded from the weight of fear and frost, he would stop to tie his saddle strap or check his compass, giving her time to breathe without having to ask. They passed no towns, only trees, frozen streams, and ravens perched like punctuation on skeletal branches. Midday, he showed her how to catch warmth from pine bark, how to scrape the papery curls from the inner layers and nest them in tinder. When the fire caught, she saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. It wasn't praise, exactly, just recognition, the kind a craftsman gave a decent stroke of the chisel. That night, he set up camp beside a black creek rimmed in ice. He used saplings and twine to rig her a low shelter, lined it with furs, and handed her a flint. "You do," he said, voice flat but not unkind. She fumbled at first. Her hands were raw, and her nerves jittered like mice under skin. But after the 10th try, the flint sparked. Fire flared, small but defiant, and she stared into it like it was the first thing she'd ever made. When she looked up, Cochise was already skinning a hare, his knife flashing clean in the dimming light. They ate in silence. Meat crisp at the edges, warm and gamey. She chewed slowly, aware of every bite, the muscles in her jaw aching with memory, of hunger, of scraps scraped from plates not meant for her, of meals she never sat down for. Later, inside her shelter, wrapped in borrowed pelts, she lay still. The ache of her feet mingled with a deeper ache she didn't have a name for. It lived in her ribs, in the part of her that still expected cruelty to fall from the sky, like sleet. She waited for it, for a hand reaching in, for a voice in the dark. But none came. Instead, she heard a soft grunt, and then the sound of furs shifting. She peered out to see Cochise rolling his own blanket out, beside the fire, outside her shelter, not inside. He lay with his back to her, shoulders bare to the moonlight. She stared at him for a long time before she fell asleep. The days stretched on, quiet and clean. They moved like migrating birds, slow and sure, always eastward through frozen plains and pine corridors. He never touched her, not even in small ways. When she slipped crossing a stream, he extended a branch, not his hand. When the wind cut too sharp, he gave her a scarf without looking at her face. And slowly, impossibly, the fear began to lift. She began to see things she hadn't noticed before. The way he tested snow for depth with his staff before each step. The way he muttered under his breath when the trail was thin, prayers maybe, or curses. The way he paused at the top of ridges, scanning the horizon like it owed him something. One afternoon, they passed a field full of elk bones. Sunlight glinted off antlers, and the girl stopped to look. Cochise joined her after a moment, crouching beside the scattered remains. He touched the skull with his knuckles, then closed his eyes. She crouched too, curiosity piqued. What happened? He opened his eyes slowly. Snow came fast. They couldn't find their trail. Couldn't they smell it? She asked. He looked at her, then shook his head. Sometimes wind lies. She didn't know what to say to that. But the words stayed with her, echoing oddly in her chest. That night she laughed. It wasn't a big thing. Just a small sound, a puff of surprise, when a fox darted into camp, snatched a strip of meat, and ran off like it had won a war. Cochise's expression didn't change, but when she looked at him, his eyes had softened. She covered her mouth, embarrassed. He handed her another piece of meat. Fox was smart, he said, almost smiling. Something loosened in her ribs. The next evening, they camped beneath an overhang of stone shaped like a wave frozen mid-crash. Wind howled across the flats, but the rock broke it, and they built fire with pine branches and twisted grass. As they sat near the flames, she asked quietly, "Why did you trade for me?" Cochise didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, then reached down to scoop snow into a pot. "You looked hollow," he said finally, "like something that had been emptied too many times." She nodded slowly. "And now," he glanced at her, "now you walk, you eat. You build fire. That's not the same as whole." He didn't respond, but his silence wasn't cruel. It was more like agreement, like he knew too well what brokenness felt like, and also knew better than to rush its healing. She shifted closer to the flame. "I used to have a name." He looked over, waited. "My mother gave it to me, after the flowers that bloomed where she was born. It was a soft name, but no one says it now. Not even me." Cochise tilted his head. "You don't need to tell it. I want to, but I don't know if I still deserve it." He took a long breath. "A name isn't given once. It's earned every day." She stared at him. The fire cracked between them, and for a moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, seen. When sleep came that night, it was warm and dreamless. The trail ahead was still long, and the road behind still haunted her in quiet ways. But her feet no longer dragged. Her silence no longer meant shame. And somewhere deep beneath the snow and silence, something had begun to thaw. They came down from the ridgeline at first thaw, when the trees wept cold tears and the wind lost its edge. Days of walking had dried her fear into a quiet grit, and though she still glanced over her shoulder now and then, it was no longer because she expected to be chased. It was only habit, like checking a wound that had mostly scabbed. Cochise said they'd reach town by noon. He didn't say why. He rarely explained his movements, but she'd come to understand his silences. When he said they were going, it meant there was no meat left, or the snow line had shifted, or he'd read something in the trees that told him it was time. He moved by knowledge deeper than maps. As the town crept into view, so did the weight of the past weeks, the crate, the bids, the eyes that scrape her raw. She pulled her shawl closer and let her hair fall across her face. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of being seen or not being recognized at all. Cochise led the Mustangs through the muddy road with the same calm he brought to everything. She walked beside him, step for step, though she felt every gaze snap to her like a snare. Children stopped playing to stare. A pair of men leaned against the smithy and didn't speak, but their faces turned flint-hard. Someone spat. She saw Mrs. Mercy Crowley before the woman spoke, lace gloves as always, standing just outside the church steps, lips tight and nostrils pinched, as if the very sight of the girl stirred a stench. "Well," Mercy said, voice slicing through the air, "I suppose we know what became of her." The girl did not stop. She kept walking, but each word bit deep. "I heard she went off with the Apache, traded herself like wheat for winter. Shame. Her mother had such promise." Another woman gasped, scandalized more by the directness than the slander. Mercy just smiled behind her glove, as though she were offering tea. They reached the trading post, and Cochise tied the horses. The girl stood at his side as he handed over a bundle of pelts, clean, supple, stacked with care. The shopkeeper, a broad man with pale eyes, took the bundle without a word, glancing between them with something that was not quite fear and not quite loathing. "We need salt," Cochise said. The shopkeeper nodded, filled a small sack, and placed it on the counter. His hands were quick but jittery, like a man who didn't know whether to call the sheriff or just pray. The girl spotted old Mary sitting on her usual stool by the stove, knitting something from a ball of red yarn. The old woman didn't rise, didn't smile, but she met the girl's eyes. For a long breath, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Mary folded a square of wool and walked over. "You'll catch chill in that threadbare thing," she said, and placed the knitted shawl over the girl's shoulders with weathered hands. "Wind don't care what color your man is. Neither should your bones." The girl opened her mouth to thank her, but Mary was already gone, back to her corner and her yarn. It should have been a comfort. Instead, it lit a strange heat behind the girl's ribs. Kindness made the cruelty louder, somehow sharper by comparison. It made her want to scream or cry or run, and she hated that about herself. Hated how weak her own body still thought she was. They left the shop, and the street felt tighter now. Eyes pressed from every direction, loud in their judgment even when no words came. A boy about 10 stood by the well and stared openly. When the girl met his gaze, he scrunched his nose and shouted, "Whore." She froze. Cochise was beside her before she could breathe, one hand resting on her back, the other hovering near the boy, but not reaching, not striking, just presence. That was enough. The boy stumbled back and ran, tripping over the well bucket in his haste. The girl's jaw trembled, but her feet held. She looked up at Cochise, then looked away. "They see what they want," she whispered. "They see their fear," he answered. "I don't want to be feared," she said. "Then do not fear yourself." The words settled into her like seeds, painful, uncertain, but planted. As they walked toward the livery to trade for oats and tobacco, she overheard the rancher's name. Elmer Dykes. The one who'd nearly won her. He'd been telling folks the Apache had stolen his property, claimed Cochise threatened him, that he was robbed in public and made a fool by a savage and his harlot. The girl stopped in the middle of the street. Cochise turned. His eyes narrowed. "He's lying," she said, voice shaking. "I know. They'll believe him. They want to." The sun burned low, bleeding orange across the roofs, and the town square began to empty. The weight of the day settled in her spine. She watched two women whisper behind their gloved hands and knew her name was on their tongues, what little of it remained. She and Cochise returned to the edge of town and set camp in a narrow canyon half a mile out. They didn't speak for a long time. The wind carried the taste of ash and iron. Coyotes cried somewhere far off. That night, as they sat by the fire, she said, "What happens when they come for us?" Cochise glanced at the flames, then back at her. "Then we see what kind of ground you stand on." The fire cracked. She watched the sparks rise into the dark, each one vanishing before it reached the stars. She realized something then, something small but sharp. She was no longer afraid of Cochise, but she was still afraid of who she used to be. The girl who flinched under hands, who bent at the sound of boots, who believed that silence was the safest skin to wear. Now that skin didn't fit, and what lay beneath was still tender. But it was hers. As she curled into her bedroll, shawl wrapped tight and fingers warm, she wondered, not what the town would do next, but what she might. The thought scared her, but it also stirred something fierce and flickering deep inside. She slept with her back to the fire, but not to him, and the stars stayed out all night. The canyon was quiet that morning, hushed in the way only the desert could manage, every rock holding its breath, every shadow still. The girl was stacking wood when she heard it, the distant thud of hooves on packed earth. Not many, maybe 3 horses. Enough to bring trouble, not justice. Cochise was already moving. He didn't panic, didn't shout. He simply rose from the stream where he'd been filling the water skins and placed them gently on a flat rock, eyes tilted to the sound. When he looked at her, she knew it was time to choose between fear and fire. She dropped the wood and stepped closer to him, her breath shallow in her throat. "They're coming," she said. He nodded once. "Stay here." But she followed. The riders came into view slowly. First the silhouettes, then the shine of metal buttons, and finally the faces. Elmer Dykes led them, a revolver on his hip and spit on his lips. The other 2 were rougher, mercenary types, hungry for coin and the illusion of purpose. Dykes didn't wait for pleasantries. He reined in his horse hard and pointed at the girl. "That one belongs to me." Cochise stood still, arms at his sides, hands loose. "She is not yours. She was paid for." Dykes' voice was loud, too loud, like he was performing for ghosts. "She was on the block. I had the winning bid." "You did not," Cochise replied, calm as stone. One of the others, a broad man with a sloping brow, chuckled. "Don't matter none. You think we're here to argue." The girl stepped behind Cochise, but only just. Her hands curled at her sides. "You left me to die," she said, loud enough for them to hear. "You paid nothing but shame." Dykes turned his gaze on her, full of mockery. "You think this savage saved you? He just wants a different kind of use." She felt the heat behind her eyes, but she didn't flinch. "Not now. He gave me freedom." "Ain't free if someone else has to give it to you," Dykes snarled, and then his hand moved. Not to the gun, but to the reins, to turn his horse and circle, get position. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. The others shifted in their saddles, too, reading signals, waiting for an excuse. Then the broad one drew his knife. Cochise stepped forward. It happened fast, too fast for her to scream. Steel flashed in the sunlight, and the 2 men collided in a whirl of dust and noise. The knife caught Cochise across the ribs, a quick red bloom. But his hands closed around the attacker's wrist, twisted hard, and the man cried out as bone snapped. The knife hit the dirt. Cochise shoved the man off his feet. Dykes drew his pistol halfway, then stopped, seeing his hired muscle writhing on the ground, gasping curses through his teeth. "Enough," Cochise said, blood darkening his shirt. "Go." Dykes looked between them, measuring risk, pride, and the thickness of the law in these parts. Finally, he spit in the dirt and turned his horse. "This ain't over," he muttered. The girl watched them disappear over the rise. Only when the hoofbeats faded did she turn to Cochise. "You're bleeding." He nodded once, still standing like a man carved from cliffside. But his hand pressed firm against his side. "Sit," she said, already moving. She fetched water, tore strips from a spare cloth, built a fire with shaking hands. He watched her not with pride or gratitude, but with something quieter, acceptance. When she pressed the cloth to the wound, he grunted once, but didn't pull away. "I should have known they'd come," she said. "I should have stopped them. You can't stop what men like that carry inside them. But I could have done more." "You stayed," he said. "That's more than most." She tied the cloth tight. The bleeding slowed. He leaned back, breathing shallow, letting the heat from the fire reach into his bones. She sat beside him, not touching now, just near. The canyon wind sang, low between the stones. "I used to think the world would change if I was good enough," she said. "If I worked hard, stayed quiet, didn't complain." He turned his face toward her. But they don't want good, she continued. They want obedient. They want broken in. Cochise's eyes stayed on hers. And now I want to be whole, even if they hate me for it. He gave a slow nod, not of approval, but of understanding. It's harder than silence. Yes, but it's mine. She looked at his wound again, red now against white cloth. You shouldn't have stood in front of me. He breathed once, slow. I always will. Her eyes burned. No one had ever said such a thing to her. Not her father, not the women in town, not the empty churches where she once prayed to be seen. She reached up, brushed hair from his forehead. It was a small thing, a quiet thing. He didn't move away. And though the canyon still echoed with the memory of threat, though blood still marked the dust at their feet, the space between them felt safe. That night, after the fire dimmed and the stars unfurled like a spilled jar of light, she sat awake while Cochise slept. His breath was steady, though pained. She watched over him, the way he had watched over her. The world wasn't different, but she was. And in the stillness between pain and sleep, she felt the first roots of something real grow beneath her ribs, tender, stubborn, and true. Morning came in layers of gray and hush, as if the sky were holding its breath for what the day would bring. A light snowfall drifted over the canyon, softening the edges of stone and silence. The fire had burned down to embers. Cochise still slept, his breath shallow but steady beneath the bandages she had changed twice in the night. The girl sat beside him, knees drawn to her chest, shawl pulled tight, gaze fixed on the trail that led back to town. She could feel the tension in her limbs like a string pulled taut, her body remembering fear, her mind resisting it. They wouldn't let it be. Not men like Dykes. He would come again, this time louder, crueler, armed with law or fire or both. He wasn't chasing her because he wanted her. He was chasing her because she'd walked away, because she'd made a choice. Cochise stirred beside her, his eyes opened slowly, unreadable as ever. They will return, he said. She nodded. I know. He pushed himself upright with effort, every breath costing him. You should go. I'm not leaving you. His mouth twitched in what could have been the start of a protest, but her eyes stopped him. Whatever he saw in them, it wasn't a girl he could command. Not anymore. I won't hide, she said. Not for them. Not for anyone. Cochise studied her a long moment, then gave a small nod, the kind given from one warrior to another. Not a child. Not a burden. An equal. They broke camp slowly. Every movement was careful, wrapped in silence and necessity. Cochise's wound slowed him, but he refused her offer to ride. He led the mustangs with quiet strength, feet firm in the snow. The girl walked beside him, her fingers skimming the mane of the gentler horse, more to calm herself than the beast. They took the long way to town, through narrow gullies and thorn-choked brush. The snow thickened as the sun rose, turning the world into a white veil, beautiful and blinding. By the time the church steeple came into view, her shawl was soaked through, but she didn't shiver. She had never felt so clear. Dead Mare was waiting. At the edge of town, the silence broke. A single gunshot cracked the air, not close, but near enough to be a warning. Then voices, rough and numerous, echoed from the square. They came early, she said. Cochise didn't respond. He scanned the buildings, the windows, the overhangs. His body tensed, but he didn't turn back. They walked straight in. A crowd had gathered near the general store. Sheriff Lyle stood on the porch, arms crossed, face pale beneath his hat. But it was Deputy Whitlow who stepped forward to meet them. His coat flapped in the wind like a reluctant flag. Dykes's men, he said, voice low. 15 or more. Drunk. Armed. Say they're enforcing justice. There was no crime, Cochise said. Whitlow didn't argue. His eyes flicked to the girl. You walking like this, someone's gonna die. She stepped forward, voice calm. If I don't walk in, I die anyway. He hesitated, then stepped aside. They moved toward the square, boots crunching over dirty snow. The crowd parted slowly, reluctantly, as if proximity might damn them. Dykes stood on a crate now, the same one she'd been sold from. His face was flushed with drink and purpose. He saw her and grinned with teeth that looked too white. Well, look what wandered back. Thought the mutt might have buried you in the hills. The girl kept walking. Cochise beside her, tall and quiet. I told you she was stolen, Dyke said, voice rising. I told you the Apache turned her into one of his. You're right, she said. The words stopped him cold. I was taken, she said. But not by him. She stepped onto the crate, the very wood where her silence had once been currency. Now it was her altar. You sold me like scrap, like something that ate too much. And he, she pointed to Cochise without looking at him, gave 2 horses to save me. But it wasn't the horses. It was the choice. The townsfolk watched, half in awe, half in fear. No one moved. I am not a thing, she said. Not your shame. Not your story. Not your lesson. Dykes pulled his pistol. You ungrateful little. The click of Whitlow's shotgun behind him stopped the sentence mid-air. Drop it, the deputy said. Dykes turned. You defend them? I defend the law, Whitlow said. And the truth. Other guns came up now, some from Dykes' men, but not all. A few townsfolk. Even old Mary, standing on the chapel steps with a rifle that looked too big for her arms, but sat steady as scripture. No crime was committed here, Whitlow said. Except maybe the one we all let happen last winter. Dykes hesitated. Rage and panic twisted his face. Then he lunged, not at the girl, not at the deputy, but at Cochise. She didn't scream. Cochise moved with the grace of a wounded mountain cat. He stepped to the side, let the man stumble past, then caught him by the coat and threw him into the snow. The girl picked up the dropped pistol. She held it low, not raised, not aimed. This is what you do, she said. You make people choose between silence or sin. Dykes groaned in the snow, face red with fury and cold. But I choose myself. She dropped the gun at his feet. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of reckoning, of release, of something long overdue. Cochise stepped beside her. Didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The girl looked around the square. Some people still sneered. Some still doubted. But they weren't the ones she saw. She saw the ones who didn't look away. She took Cochise's hand, not for permission or possession, but for what it was, a promise. They left town together, past the store, past the church, past the crate. As they walked toward the edge of Dead Mare, old Mary called after them, her voice thin but sharp. Wind don't care what name you wear, girl. But you remember yours. The girl smiled. The snow was still falling. The sky, now a soft gold, opened like a wound beginning to heal. They rode into it, slow, unafraid, unashamed. And if there was dust in the air, it danced with the snow. If there was sorrow, it walked behind them like a shadow that had finally let go. Because some stories don't end in fire or fury. Some end in choosing to live. And if you've ever been torn apart by what others say you are, remember this. Dignity grows quiet, like roots under frost. But when spring comes, it blooms anyway.